He had expected to receive a black-edged letter within the year. A polite, formal notice from a country physician informing him that his inconvenient, consumptive duchess had finally succumbed to the northern damp he had so dutifully provided. He had expected to feel a mild, fleeting irritation at the necessity of arranging a suitably somber funeral, and then a faint sense of relief. He did not expect to return to his forgotten estate 3 years later, broken and seeking a tomb of his own, only to find it fiercely, stubbornly alive. He did not expect to find her at its heart, not a dying songbird in a gilded cage, but a queen forged in mud and ledgers, who looked at him not with fear or adoration, but with the cool, appraising gaze of a woman who had built a kingdom from the ruins he had left her and was not entirely sure he was worth the price of admission. The solicitor's office smelled of dry paper and drier law, a scent as devoid of life as the arrangement being finalized within its mahogany-paneled walls. Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the gray London street below, though he saw none of it. He saw instead the endless, grinding machinery of his obligations, the political maneuvering in the House of Lords, the management of a dozen properties that bled money and prestige, the crushing weight of a title that had been in his family for 500 years and felt, in his hands, like a piece of crumbling masonry threatening to fall. This marriage was just another gear in that machine, a distasteful but necessary one. Across the room, she sat. He had not truly looked at her, not beyond a cursory assessment. Alara, her name was. A name like a whisper. She was the last resort, a distant, thrice-removed cousin from a branch of the family tree that had long ago withered. Her guardian, a sweating, portly man whose desperation was a cloying scent in the room, had practically sold her for the promise of settled debts and a small, remote living. Alastair had agreed without argument. The girl came with a negligible dowry, but, more importantly, no powerful family to meddle in his affairs. She was by all accounts sickly, a creature of weak lungs and paler disposition. Perfect. She would be the Duchess of Blackwood on paper, satisfy the Crown's endless hints about securing the line, and then, with any luck, she would fade quietly away in whatever remote corner of his vast holdings he chose to stash her. He heard the solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, clear his throat. "Your Grace, if you would." Alastair turned from the window. The room was cast in the flat, unforgiving light of a London afternoon. He saw her properly for a moment then. She was pale, yes, almost translucent, as if she were already beginning to fade. Her dress was a drab gray wool, clean but worn thin at the cuffs. She was little more than a slip of a thing, lost in the heavy oak chair. But it was her eyes that caught him, just for a second. They were not frightened or demure. They were a startling, lucid gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were fixed on him with an unnerving stillness. There was no plea in them. There was nothing but a profound, weary assessment. It was the look of a creature that had been cornered so many times it had forgotten how to run and was now merely calculating the cost of the final blow. He strode to the desk, the sound of his polished boots sharp on the floorboards. He ignored the chair offered to him and remained standing, a towering, dark-clad figure of authority. He dipped the pen in the inkwell and signed his name with a series of sharp, angry slashes of the nib. Alastair James Fitzroy, Duke of Blackwood. The name felt like an accusation. "Now the bride," Abernathy murmured, pushing the document across the polished expanse of the desk. Her guardian nudged her, a small, urgent gesture. She rose without a sound and moved to the desk. She was shorter than he had realized, the top of her head barely reaching his breastbone. She took the pen from the solicitor's outstretched hand. Her fingers were long and thin, the knuckles white. As she leaned forward to sign, a small, dry cough escaped her lips. It was a tiny sound, a brittle, rasping thing, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound of his freedom. Alastair's jaw tightened. He had heard that sound before, in the damp, crowded field hospitals of the peninsula. It was the sound of lungs giving up. The physician's report had called it a constitutional weakness, a delicacy of the chest. Alastair called it a solution. She signed her name, Alara Finch. The script was surprisingly clear and steady, a line of perfect, unadorned letters. She did not add his title. She simply put the pen down, her part in the transaction complete. "It is done," Abernathy announced with a sigh of relief, as if he had just successfully docked a ship in a storm. "Congratulations, Your Grace, Your Grace." Alastair did not acknowledge the title bestowed upon her. He tossed a heavy purse onto the desk. The clink of gold was obscene in the quiet room. "For your troubles, Abernathy." And for him, he gave a curt nod toward the Guardian, who was already eyeing the purse with a raptor's gleam. "See that her things are packed. The carriage leaves at dawn. We travel north." He turned to leave, his duty fulfilled. He had acquired a duchess. Now he just had to dispose of her. "Your Grace." Her voice stopped him at the door. It was low and clear, without the breathless quality he had expected from her cough. He turned, impatient. She stood by the desk, a small, still figure in the cavernous room. Her hands were clasped before her. She had not looked at the purse of gold. She had not looked at her relieved guardian. She was looking only at him. "Where, precisely, are we going?" she asked. The question was simple, direct. It was not the question of a trembling bride or a grateful pauper. It was the question of a fellow traveler mapping out a journey. For the second time, he felt a flicker of something other than dismissive irritation. It was annoyance, sharp and unwelcome. "To Blackwood Manor," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "It is your new home." He imbued the word home with all the cold, desolate finality he could muster. He wanted her to understand. This was not a beginning. It was an end. Her end. She held his gaze for a long moment. Her lucid, gray eyes revealed nothing. Then she gave a single, slight nod. It was not a gesture of submission. It was one of acknowledgement, a point noted on a map. Then she turned away, dismissing him as completely as he had intended to dismiss her, and went back to her chair to wait. Alastair left the office, a strange and unsettling feeling coiling in his gut. He had just purchased a wife he expected to die, and for the first time, it occurred to him that she might have other plans. Alara watched him go. The sheer, oppressive force of his presence receded from the room like a physical tide, leaving behind a silence that was blessedly empty. Her uncle was already whispering with Mr. Abernathy, their heads together over the Duke's purse, their voices a-low, conspiratorial buzz. They paid her no more mind than they would a piece of furniture. She had ceased to be their problem and had become the Duke's. She drew a slow, careful breath, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest, the slight, treacherous rasp. The cough was her constant companion, the metronome marking the time she had left. Everyone had always treated it as such. Her parents, before they had succumbed to the influenza. Her uncle, after he had taken her in with all the enthusiasm of a man saddled with a lame horse. The doctors, with their sad shakes of the head and their prescriptions for foul-tasting tinctures and sea air she could not afford. They all saw her as a flickering candle, one gust away from being extinguished. But a candle that still flickered was not yet out. She had learned to live in the space of that flicker. She had learned to read the accounts and stretch a shilling into a pound. She had learned to mend her own clothes until the fabric was more patched than original. She had learned that hope was a luxury, but that survival was a skill. It was a cold, hard, practical thing, survival. It had nothing to do with dreams and everything to do with enduring. The Duke of Blackwood. He was a force of nature, a storm of dark broadcloth and cold disdain. He looked at her and saw a convenient death. She looked at him and saw an opportunity, not for love or happiness, or any of the foolish things girls in her former station might have dreamed of. She saw a chance for something far more valuable. A roof, food, a bed, however cold. He was banishing her. She had seen in the way he said the name Blackwood Manor. It was a place he despised, a place he was sending her to be forgotten. Good. She had spent her entire life being overlooked. For the first time, it might be an advantage. He was giving her a cage, but he was also giving her the keys. He did not care what she did within it, so long as she stayed there and, eventually, died there. A dry, humorless smile touched her lips for a brief moment. He did not know her. He did not know the sheer, stubborn refusal to yield that had kept her alive when by all rights she should have faded years ago. He thought he was sentencing her to death. She considered it a reprieve. The journey north was a study in grim silence. It lasted 4 days. For 4 days, Alara sat opposite the Duke in the stifling confines of his perfectly sprung carriage, the rhythmic drumming of the horse's hooves and the creak of leather the only consistent sounds between them. He did not speak to her. After the first day, during which she had attempted a few polite, meaningless pleasantries that were met with a wall of implacable quiet, she gave up. She retreated into her own silence, a space she had long ago learned to furnish with her own thoughts. She watched him when she thought he was not aware of it. He spent most of the journey staring out the window, his jaw set, his gaze distant. He looked like a man perpetually braced for a battle that was already over, a man haunted by victories that cost too much. The lines around his eyes and mouth were not those of age, but of immense, soul-crushing weariness. He was a magnificent ruin of a man, and he carried his brokenness like a shield. She recognized the look. It was a more grandiose version of the same armor she wore, and the recognition did not foster sympathy, only a detached sense of understanding. They were two sides of the same coin, minted in different metals. The landscape changed as they traveled. The gentle, rolling fields of the south gave way to harsher, more rugged terrain. The skies seemed to grow heavier, the clouds pressing down, pregnant with a rain that was always threatening but never quite breaking. The air grew colder. Alara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the damp chill seep into her bones. The Duke seemed not to notice it. The cold was his natural element. On the evening of the 4th day, the carriage turned off the main post road and onto a smaller, unpaved track. The ride, which had been merely monotonous, became actively punishing. The wheels lurched and shuddered in deep, muddy ruts. Gnarled branches, heavy with moss, clawed at the windows of the coach. The world outside was a descending twilight of deep greens and slate grays. The air smelled of wet earth, of decay, of things left undisturbed for too long. Alara felt a lurch in her stomach that had nothing to do with the rocking of the carriage. This was it. This was the place he had chosen for her. This was Blackwood Manor. Finally, the carriage slowed and broke through a final thicket of overgrown rhododendrons. It came to a stop in a wide, gravel-strewn sweep that was more weeds than gravel. Before them stood the house. It was not a house. It was a gravestone, a vast, brooding pile of dark gray stone. It seemed to rise from the earth rather than stand upon it. It was a chaotic jumble of architectural styles, a grim Tudor heart, a stern Jacobean wing, a crumbling Georgian facade, added like a foolish afterthought. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over much of the stonework, prying at the mortar, while other sections were stained black with damp. Dozens of windows stared out like vacant eyes, many of them boarded up, others simply dark. Of the 4 great chimneys she could see, only one trickled a lazy, unenthusiastic plume of smoke into the bruised purple sky. The estate was not merely neglected. It felt malevolent. It felt as if it were actively rotting, a great, beached leviathan slowly being consumed by the land and the damp. The carriage door was opened by a footman who looked as weary and gray as the house itself. The Duke descended without a word, not even glancing back at her. He strode to the massive, iron-studded front door and pounded on it with his fist. The sound was flat and dead, swallowed by the sheer mass of the house. Alara remained in the carriage, her hands clenched in her lap. A deep, racking cough shook her frame as she pressed a handkerchief to her lips, tasting the familiar, coppery tang of exhaustion. This was more than she had bargained for. She had expected neglect, not active decay. She had prepared for a cold home, not a tomb. The great door groaned open, revealing a sliver of flickering, uncertain light. A woman stood there, gaunt and severe, holding a single candle. The Duke spoke to the woman, his voice a low command that carried on the damp air. "Mrs. Gable, I have brought the Duchess." She will be residing here. See that she is made comfortable. The word comfortable was a masterpiece of cynical understatement. Her rooms are in the West Wing. As you instructed, Your Grace. The woman's voice was as dry and brittle as old bones. The old nursery suite. The old nursery. The place where the hopes of a family began, or ended. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Good, the Duke said. He turned then, his gaze sweeping past her, past the carriage, toward the fresh team of horses already being led from the shadows of the stable block. His escape. He finally looked at her, his face an unreadable mask in the growing darkness. He was a stranger who owned her. He had brought her to this place of ruin and was now preparing to abandon her in it. Your Grace, she began, her voice small. He cut her off. I have fulfilled my obligation to the crown and to your family, he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. This is your home now. Your staff will see to your needs. My affairs require me in London. I do not expect to be disturbed. He did not say, Live well. He did not say, I hope you are happy, he said, Do not disturb me, which was the most honest thing he had said to her yet. It was a command to exist quietly and, eventually, to cease existing just as quietly. He turned his back on her, a final dismissive act. He swung himself onto the fresh horse with an ease that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He did not look back. Not once. He spurred the horse, and without another word, he galloped away into the darkness, the sound of his departure quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence of the estate. He left her there, a duchess in name only, standing in the mud and the drizzle, before a house that was actively dying, with nothing but a hostile housekeeper and the echo of his indifference for company. The rain, which had been threatening for days, finally began to fall. Cold, miserable drops that soaked her thin shawl and chilled her to the bone. She looked up at the looming facade of Blackwood Manor. It looked back at her, a silent, stony challenge. For a long, terrible moment, Alara felt the fragile structure of her resolve begin to crumble. The sheer, overwhelming hopelessness of it all washed over her. He had won. He had found the one place on earth that could surely kill her. Then, deep within her, something small and hard and stubborn sparked. It was the same instinct that had kept her breathing through a dozen winters, the same defiance that had stared down pitying doctors. It was rage, a cold, quiet, clean-burning rage. He had left her here to die. She would not give him the satisfaction. Drawing a ragged, painful breath of the damp, earthy air, Alara alighted from the carriage. Her worn leather shoes sank into the mud. She did not flinch. She took another step, and then another, walking steadily toward the gaping maw of the front door, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, still stood, holding her single, flickering candle like a sentinel at the gates of hell. Alara met the older woman's cold, resentful gaze without wavering. "I'm the Duchess," she said, her voice small but clear in the sudden stillness. "Take me to my rooms." The first few weeks were a descent into a gray, damp purgatory. The old nursery suite was exactly as she had feared, a collection of large, drafty rooms in the most remote and neglected wing of the house. The wallpaper, once a cheerful pattern of faded roses, was now a tapestry of mildew, peeling away from the walls in damp, leprous sheets. A constant, insidious chill radiated from the stone walls, a cold so deep and pervasive that no fire seemed able to touch it. The small, grudging fires the maids built in the grate spat more smoke than they gave heat, leaving the air thick with the scent of cold ash. Her days fell into a monotonous, suffocating rhythm. She would wake in a vast, canopied bed, the sheets always feeling faintly damp, her breath misting in the air. A silent, resentful maid would bring her a tray with weak tea and a piece of stale bread. She would spend the day confined to her rooms, listening to the endless drumming of rain against the window panes and the rattling of the casements in the wind. And she would cough. The dampness was a physical enemy, infiltrating her lungs, settling deep in her chest, and nurturing the weakness there until it bloomed into a constant, hacking affliction. Mrs. Gable ruled the household with a miserly, iron fist. She was the personification of the house's decay, rigid, resentful, and resistant to any change. She treated Alara not as her mistress, but as an unwelcome and temporary guest. Requests for more firewood were met with thin-lipped excuses about economy. Inquiries about the state of the house were deflected with a curt, "That is not your concern, madam." The staff, following their leader's example, were ghosts, flitting past her in the hallways with downcast eyes, answering her questions in monosyllables. They were all waiting for her to die. She could see it in their faces. It was a shared, unspoken assumption. The last Duchess had lasted 6 months. The one before that, a year. Blackwood Manor had a reputation for consuming its mistresses. Alara felt herself shrinking, fading, becoming the ghost they all expected her to be. Her world narrowed to the 4 walls of her sitting room, to the view of the perpetually weeping sky and the tangled, skeletal branches of the trees outside her window. The house was winning. The damp, the cold, the profound, soul-crushing indifference of it all was seeping into her, just as the Duke had intended. She was losing weight she could not afford to lose. The fire of her rage, which had sustained her on that first night, was dwindling to a faint ember, smothered by the relentless, wet blanket of her surroundings. One afternoon, a full month after her arrival, she was lying on a chaise longue, wrapped in every blanket she possessed, listening to the rain. A particularly violent coughing fit had left her weak and breathless, her head pounding. The room was almost dark, the light outside fading to a murky gloom. The fire had died down to a few sullen, glowing coals. She was cold, so utterly, bone-deeply cold. And in that moment, something shifted. It was not a grand epiphany. It was a simple, stark realization. If she stayed in this room, she would die. It might take weeks, it might take months, but the outcome was as certain as the rising of the sun, or in this case, the endless falling of the rain. She would drown in this damp, gray prison, and no one would care. The Duke would receive his black-edged letter, feel his flicker of relief, and the world would continue to turn. Mrs. Gable would strip the sheets from the bed and wait for the next inconvenient woman to arrive. Lying there, shivering in the gloom, Alara Finch, the Duchess of Blackwood, made a choice. She could be a victim, or she could be a problem. She chose to be a problem. With a groan of effort that seemed to tear at her very sinews, she pushed herself up. Her legs were unsteady, her head swam, but she forced herself to stand. She walked to the bell pull and gave it a sharp, decisive tug. It was the first time she had used it with any real force. A few minutes later, a young maid, Sarah, appeared, her expression one of startled apprehension. "You rang, Your Grace?" the girl whispered, barely audible. "Yes," Alara said. Her voice was a hoarse croak, but she infused it with every ounce of authority she could find. "You will go to the kitchens. You will bring me the household account ledgers for the past 5 years. You will also bring me paper, ink, and every candle you can find. And then you will build a fire in this grate. Not a pathetic excuse for a fire. A roaring, vulgar furnace of a fire. If Mrs. Gable questions you, you will tell her that the Duchess is cold." The maid's eyes widened in something akin to terror. "The ledgers, Your Grace?" "Mrs. Gable, she keeps them under lock and key. Then you will tell Mrs. Gable that if she does not hand them over, I will come down and fetch them myself. I may be dying, but I am not dead yet. And while I am still breathing, I am the mistress of this house. Do you understand?" A flicker of something, awe, fear, perhaps even a nascent loyalty, crossed the girl's face. She curtsied, a quick, jerky motion. "Yes, Your Grace," and then she was gone, her footsteps hurrying down the corridor. Alara stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding, a strange, exhilarating energy coursing through her veins. It was the first real battle, and she had no idea if she would win. An hour later, the room was transformed. A blazing fire, so large it was almost scandalous, roared in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the walls and chasing the chill, for the first time, into the corners. A dozen candles burned on every available surface, filling the room with a warm, golden light. And spread out on the floor before the fire, like a general mapping out a campaign, was Alara, surrounded by a mountain of dusty, leather-bound ledgers. She had won. Sarah had returned not just with the books, but with a triumphant, conspiratorial gleam in her eye. Mrs. Gable had apparently put up a fight, but the threat of the Duchess descending into her domain had been enough. For the first time, Alara had asserted her authority, and the house had, however grudgingly, yielded. She coughed, a deep, chest-rattling sound, but this time it felt different. It was not the sound of surrender. It was the sound of a rusty engine trying to turn over. With ink-stained fingers, she opened the first ledger. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air. She was no longer a dying woman in a damp room. She was a scholar, a detective, an accountant. She was looking for the rot, and she was going to cut it out. The ledgers told a story of grotesque mismanagement. It was a saga of waste, neglect, and what looked suspiciously like petty theft. The expenditures were astronomical, the income non-existent. Vast sums were being spent on wine for the cellars, on lace for servants' uniforms that were never worn, on beeswax candles for wings of the house that had been closed for a generation. Meanwhile, the entries for roof repairs, for drainage, for basic agricultural supplies were pitifully small or absent altogether. Mrs. Gable was not just a hostile housekeeper. She was a terrible manager, clinging to the phantom protocols of a grand household while the foundations crumbled around her. She was preserving the idea of a great house, not the house itself. She was polishing the silver while the roof caved in. For 3 days, Alara did not leave the room. She worked relentlessly, fueled by hot tea and toast brought by an increasingly devoted Sarah, and by the cold fury that grew with every page she turned. She filled sheet after sheet of paper with notes, with figures, with questions. She mapped the flow of money, the points of failure, the bleeding wounds. She was not just reading accounts. She was performing an autopsy. On the 4th morning, she rose, washed her face in the cold water of the basin, and put on her best dress. The same drab gray wool she had been married in. She braided her hair neatly. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She was still pale, still thin, but the feverish spark in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, steady flame. She left her suite of rooms and walked, not with the shuffling steps of an invalid, but with a clear and determined stride, down the grand, decaying staircase and toward the kitchens, the heart of Mrs. Gable's domain. The kitchen was a vast, cavernous space, dark and grimy despite its size. A small, miserable fire burned in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. A handful of servants moved about with the listless, resentful air of a defeated army. At a large central table, presiding over it all, sat Mrs. Gable, tallying a list of supplies. Alara's entrance caused a sudden, complete silence. All activity ceased. Everyone stared. The Duchess had never come to the kitchens before. Alara walked to the table and placed her sheaf of papers down upon it with a soft thud. Mrs. Gable looked up, her face a mask of affronted disbelief. "Your Grace, this is not a place for you." "On the contrary, Mrs. Gable," Alara said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. "It seems this is the only place for me. I have been reviewing the household accounts." The housekeeper's face tightened. "The accounts are my responsibility, and you have discharged that responsibility with a singular lack of success," Alara replied, her tone dangerously mild. "According to this ledger, last month you purchased 20 pounds of beeswax candles. Where are they?" "In storage for the Duke's return." "The Duke is not returning," Alara stated as a flat fact. "And even if he were, he would not be occupying the East Wing, which has been closed since his grandfather's time. You are lighting a tomb. Meanwhile, the roof over the grain store is leaking, and the winter wheat is in danger of being ruined. Did you know?" Mrs. Gable's lips thinned to a bloodless line. "The grounds are not my concern. Everything within the boundaries of this estate is now my concern," Alara said. She tapped a page with her finger. "You are paying 3 men a full-time wage to tend the ornamental gardens. The gardens are a jungle. What precisely do they do? They're old retainers, the housekeeper began. They are lazy, Elara cut in, her voice hardening. And you're paying them with money we do not have. From this moment, their employment is terminated. We're also no longer purchasing wine, or lace, or beeswax. We will use tallow candles like the rest of the world. And we will eat what we can grow, not what we can import from France. She paused, letting her words sink in. The other servants were watching, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning fascination. This house, Elara continued, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, is not a museum to a past glory. It is a working farm that has forgotten its purpose. It is a home that is dying of cold. We're going to save it. Or rather, I am going to save it, and you will all help me. She looked directly at Mrs. Gable, whose face had gone from red to a mottled, furious white. You have a choice. You can work with me, under my direction. Your new duties will involve supervising the laundry and the mending. Or you can take your pension and retire to the dower cottage. The choice is yours. You have until noon. Without waiting for a reply, Elara turned. Her gaze fell upon a man who had been standing quietly by the door, his clothes spattered with mud, his face weathered and intelligent. He was the only person in the room who didn't look shocked. He looked interested. You, Elara said. What is your name? Thorn, your grace, he said, his voice a low rumble. I'm the groundsman, or what's left of 1 inch. Mr. Thorn, Elara said, giving him a slight nod. You and I have a great deal to discuss. Meet me in the study in 1 hour. Bring maps of the estate. All of them. She swept out of the kitchen, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and her lungs burned, but she felt more alive than she had in years. She had just declared war on the decay, and she had found her first soldier. The reclamation of Blackwood Manor began not with a grand gesture, but with a series of small, practical, and deeply unromantic acts. It began with Elara and Mr. Thorne huddled over a vast, cracked map of the estate in the freezing, dust-sheeted library, a single candle between them. Thorne, a man of few words but deep knowledge, pointed out the fallow fields, the clogged drainage ditches, the stands of timber that were rotting on the stump. Elara, with her newfound grasp of the finances, calculated costs, prioritized tasks, and made decisions. Her first official act as mistress of the estate was to order the sale of the contents of the wine cellar. The proceeds, a surprisingly substantial sum, were not used for luxuries, but for seed grain, for new slate tiles for the leaky roofs, and for the wages of a handful of local men hired to clear the drainage ditches. Mrs. Gable, stripped of her authority and seething with resentment, chose the dower cottage. Her departure was unlamented. Elara's next move was to consolidate. The house was too large, a wounded giant bleeding resources. With Thorne's help, she identified the core of the building, the kitchens, the servants' quarters, the old nursery suite she had come to loathe, and the adjacent library and study. The rest, the crumbling Georgian wing, the damp-ridden state apartments, the cavernous ballroom where no one had danced in 50 years, was to be closed off. They boarded up the windows and locked the doors, creating a smaller, more defensible fortress against the encroaching cold and damp. The staff was reduced and repurposed. The footmen who had been paid to stand around looking decorative were given axes and put to work clearing overgrown woodland. The maids were taught to salt and preserve vegetables from the newly planted kitchen garden. Elara herself worked harder than any of them. She rose before dawn and went to bed long after midnight. She was everywhere, in the kitchens tasting the soup, in the fields with Thorne discussing crop rotation, in the study, her fingers permanently stained with ink, wrestling with the ledgers. She learned the names of all the tenants, the yields of their fields, the health of their livestock. She was ruthless in her pragmatism. She leased out the unused grazing land to a sheep farmer from the next valley, generating a steady stream of income. She sold off a set of hideous silver candelabra she found tarnishing in a locked cupboard and used the money to buy 2 sturdy milk cows. The house began to change. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible at first. A wisp of smoke from a newly unblocked chimney. The sound of hammers on a repaired roof. The scent of baking bread replacing the smell of mildew. The central core of the house, once a collection of isolated, cold rooms, began to feel connected. Warmth from the constantly stoked kitchen hearth seemed to find its way up the stairs. The library, once a tomb of forgotten books, became Alara's command center, its walls covered with maps and charts, its air filled with the scent of wood smoke and old paper and drying herbs. Her own transformation was just as profound. The constant work, the fresh air, the sense of purpose. It was a better tonic than any doctor could have prescribed. The deep, rattling cough that had been her constant companion began to subside, replaced by a healthier, more robust energy. She gained a little weight. Color returned to her cheeks. She was still slender, but the frail, ghostly creature who had arrived at Blackwood 3 years prior was gone. In her place was a woman of quiet, formidable strength. Her beauty was not the soft, decorative kind prized in London drawing rooms. It was the beauty of a well-honed tool, sharp and functional and perfectly suited to its purpose. The staff's loyalty, once given grudgingly to the absent Duke and his proxy, Mrs. Gable, now belonged entirely to her. They had seen her fight for the house for them. She was not a distant lady of the manor. She was their general, their quartermaster, their chief architect. She knew their children's names. She had nursed the stable boy through a fever. She had ensured there was meat in the stew pot all winter. They did not love her in a sentimental way. They respected her. And in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the North, respect was a far more valuable currency. One crisp autumn afternoon in her 3rd year at Blackwood, Alara stood on a low hill overlooking the estate. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wood smoke and damp leaves. Below her, the house no longer looked like a gravestone. With the ivy stripped back from a main block and the windows clean and lit from within, it looked solid. It looked anchored. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys now, sturdy white plumes against a clear blue sky. In the newly fenced fields, the sheep she had acquired grazed peacefully. The kitchen garden was a riot of late-season vegetables and the sound of children, the tenants' children, whom she had organized into a makeshift school in the old laundry, carried on the wind. This was hers. She had not inherited it. She had not been given it. She had forged it from ruin with her own hands, her own will. She had taken the tomb her husband had sent her to, and she had forced it back to life. A sense of profound, fierce satisfaction washed over her. She was not just a survivor. She was a ruler. This small, isolated patch of the world was her kingdom. She had forgotten all about the Duke. He was a ghost, a name on a piece of paper, a distant, abstract concept that had no bearing on her reality. He had wanted her to die quietly. Instead, she had learned to live loudly, defiantly, and entirely without him. The thought brought a rare, genuine smile to her face. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now. The thought was amusing, but fleeting. It didn't matter what he thought. He was part of a world that no longer existed for her. She turned her face to the wind, drew a deep, clear breath all the way to the bottom of her lungs, and felt no pain. Alistair rode north with the taste of failure bitter in his mouth. London had finally broken him, not in a sudden, dramatic snap, but in a slow, grinding erosion of spirit. The political games, the endless compromises that felt like defeats, the hollow men who postured in the hallowed halls of Parliament. It had all become a suffocating weight. The latest bill, a piece of legislation he had championed, a small but meaningful attempt to improve conditions for the veterans of the war that still haunted his nights, had been gutted and defeated by men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. It was the final straw. He felt a desperate, primal urge to escape, not to one of his grand, well-staffed southern estates, full of obsequious servants and the ghosts of his responsibilities. He needed silence. He needed oblivion. He needed a place where no one would expect anything of him. And so his mind, in its exhaustion, had conjured the name Blackwood Manor, the place he had not thought of in 3 years, the rotting tomb in the north, the place he had sent his inconvenient wife to die. He remembered the physician's reports, her frail appearance, that damnable, brittle cough. He had assumed, without ever consciously thinking about it, that she was long gone. He must have missed the letter. Perhaps it had been lost, or he had been too preoccupied to register its contents. It was a failing of his secretary, no doubt. He would have to dismiss the man. He was not going to Blackwood to see her. He was going there because it was the one place on earth he owned that was synonymous with decay and silence. He was a ruined man, and he was seeking an appropriate ruin to house his despair. He imagined the house as he had last seen it, dark, crumbling, shrouded in mist and misery. It seemed a fitting backdrop for his own internal landscape. He would sit in a dusty, silent room, drink himself into a stupor, and let the damp and the rot have their way. It was a form of surrender, and he was too tired to fight anymore. The journey was a blur of grim inns and exhausted horses. He pushed himself and his mount mercilessly, driven by a need to outrun the clamor of his own thoughts. As he rode deeper into the familiar, bleak landscape of the north, a strange sense of anticipation began to build. The expectation of ruin. It was late afternoon when he finally turned off the post road onto the track leading to the manor. He braced himself for the lurching, muddy path he remembered. But the track was different. It was still unpaved, but the ruts had been filled with gravel. The surface was level and firm. The overhanging branches had been cut back, allowing slivers of the late afternoon sun to dapple the road. Alistair frowned. It was a small thing, but it was wrong. It was a sign of maintenance, of care. He spurred his horse on, a prickle of unease disturbing his carefully curated despair. He broke through the familiar tree-line and reined his horse in sharply, his breath catching in his throat. This was not the place he remembered. The wild, weed-choked gravel sweep was gone, replaced by a tidy, well-raked drive. The tangled jungle of ornamental gardens had been tamed, the lawns scythed, the hedges clipped. The house itself, it was the same grim stone pile, but it was no longer dying. The suffocating ivy had been stripped away from the central block, revealing the clean lines of the stonework beneath. The windows were not vacant, boarded-up eyes. They were clean, and behind several of them, warm, golden light glowed. And from 3 of the great chimneys, plumes of pale gray smoke rose straight and steady into the crisp autumn air. The house was not a tomb. It was breathing. Alistair sat on his horse, utterly disoriented. He felt like a man who had returned to his own grave only to find it occupied by a thriving market garden. What in God's name had happened here? Had his stewards taken some uncharacteristic initiative? It was unthinkable. He dismounted, his legs stiff, his mind reeling. As his boots hit the gravel, the great front door opened. He had not knocked. A man stood there, a weathered, sturdy-looking fellow with intelligent eyes. He held no candle. The hall behind him was brightly lit. He looked at Alistair, at his travel-stained clothes and exhausted horse, with a calm, appraising gaze. There was no deference in it, no fawning recognition of his title. "Can I help you?" the man asked. His tone was polite, but firm. The tone of a man asking a stranger his business. Alistair was so taken aback he could barely speak. "This is Blackwood Manor," he stated, as if the man might not be aware. "I'm the Duke of Blackwood." The man, Thorne, did not so much as blink. We know who you are, Your Grace. It's been a long time." He made no move to bow, no gesture of welcome. He simply stood there, a gatekeeper at a fortress that Alistair no longer recognized. "The Duchess is in the study. She's expecting the wool merchant this afternoon. You'll have to wait." The Duchess. The words hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow. The Duchess. Not a ghost, not a memory, not the subject of a black-edged letter. A living, breathing person who was expecting the wool merchant. He pushed past Thorne, his weariness forgotten, replaced by a dizzying mix of disbelief and a strange, unnameable anger. He strode down the hall. It was clean. It was warm. The air smelled not of damp and decay, but of beeswax, wood smoke, and something else, something savory and delicious from the direction of the kitchens. He threw open the door to the study. And there she was. She was not on a bed or on a chaise longue. She was sitting at his desk. His desk. The massive oak monstrosity that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him. The desk was not an aristocratic prop. It was a functioning workspace, covered in papers, ledgers, and maps. An ink stain smudged her cheek, and there was a streak of what looked like dirt on her sleeve. She looked up as he burst into the room, her expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. Her hair was simply braided, her dress a practical, dark blue wool. She was no longer translucent. The frail, fading girl from the solicitor's office was gone. The woman before him was substantial. The bones of her face were still fine and delicate, but they were now the framework for a startling, self-possessed strength. And her eyes, they were the same lucid, winter sky gray he remembered, but now they held not just weary assessment, but an unmistakable, unwavering authority. She looked magnificent. She looked at him, a complete stranger who had just stormed into her office, and a flicker of recognition dawned in her eyes. It was followed by a profound, almost comical lack of surprise. She simply placed her pen down with deliberate care. Alistair stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the ghost of his memory with the vibrant reality before him. All the carefully constructed pronouncements he might have made, all the ducal authority he might have mustered, evaporated in the face of this utter, confounding transformation. Only one thought, blunt and stupid, made its way to his lips. "You're alive," he said. His voice was a harsh, incredulous rasp. Alara looked at him, at his wild, disheveled appearance, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. She took in a fine layer of dust on his shoulders, the mud on his boots. He looked like a man who had been pursued by demons and had lost the race. She felt a flicker of something, but it was not pity. It was the detached interest of a naturalist observing a strange and unexpected specimen. A small, wry smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she replied, her voice cool and crisp as the autumn air. "I shall endeavor to rectify the situation at a later date. Now, if you will excuse me, I'm expecting the wool merchant." And with that, she picked up her pen and returned to her ledgers, leaving the Duke of Blackwood standing in the middle of the room, an unwelcome intruder in the house he owned, in the life he had so carelessly discarded, and in the presence of a woman he had sent away to die, who had instead, it seemed, decided to live and thrive. The silence in the study was no longer his to command. It was hers, and it was filled with the quiet, scratching sound of her pen on paper, a sound more powerful and unnerving than any shouted recrimination. Alistair stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the foundations of his world, of his own identity, shift beneath his feet. He had come here seeking a tomb, a quiet place to lick his wounds. He had found a kingdom, and its queen had just put him on notice. For a long moment, Alistair could not process the scene. His exhausted mind, which had been braced for the familiar comforts of rot and silence, was short-circuiting. The woman at the desk, this calm, ink-stained stranger wearing his wife's face, continued to write. She was not ignoring him in a pointed, dramatic way. She was simply working. He was an interruption, a minor and unexpected variable in a day that clearly had its own demanding schedule. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all finally broke through his stupor. He was the Duke of Blackwood. This was his house, his study, his desk. He had come home, broken and defeated, and he had found his place usurped by the last person on earth he had expected to see. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. It was the voice he used in Parliament to quell dissent, the voice that made hardened men flinch. Alara did not look up. She finished her line of figures, blotted the ink with a practiced hand, and then finally raised her head. Her gray eyes met his, and there was no fear in them, only a faint, weary impatience. "The meaning of what precisely, Your Grace?" she asked. "The fact that I am alive? The fact that the house is not a ruin? Or the fact that I am attempting to conclude a favorable deal for 3 years' worth of fleece before the light fails? You will need to be more specific. My time is valuable." His anger, a familiar, hot thing, rose in his chest, but it was met with a wall of such unshakable calm that it faltered. He was accustomed to hysterics, to tears, to pleading. He had no idea what to do with this cool, pragmatic efficiency. This house, the grounds, the staff, he gestured vaguely at a loss. What have you done? I have prevented it from collapsing into a pile of expensive, mortgaged rubble, she said simply. I have made it solvent. I have made it warm. In short, I have done the job that your highly paid, incompetent stewards failed to do for 20 years. She stood up, and he was struck again by how much she had changed. She was still slender, but she moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She walked to the window and looked out, her back to him. You gave me a dying house, a resentful staff, and an impossible budget, she said, her voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. You expected me to fail. You expected me to die. It was a perfectly logical assumption, given the circumstances. I simply happened to be a poor investment in that regard. He started, but he had no response. She was right. He had expected exactly that. To hear it laid out so baldly, so devoid of accusation or sentiment, was more disarming than any tirade. A knock came at the door, and Thorne poked his head in. Begging your pardon, your grace, he said, his eyes on Alara, completely ignoring Alistair. Mr. Blevins is here about the wool. Thank you, Thorne, Alara said, turning from the window. Send him in, and bring tea. For 2 inch, she glanced briefly at Alistair. The Duke looks as though he could use some. It was a dismissal, a clear, unequivocal statement that her business was more important than his sudden, dramatic reappearance. He, the master of the house, was being told to sit quietly in the corner while she conducted her affairs. The wool merchant, a stout, ruddy-faced man named Blevins, entered the room, his gaze going directly to Alara. Your Grace, he said with genuine warmth and respect. He barely spared Alistair a glance, assuming him to be a secretary or a poor relation. For the next half hour, Alistair was forced to witness something utterly surreal. He sat in a wing-back chair by the cold fireplace while his wife, the sickly girl he had abandoned, haggled with a wool merchant. And she was brilliant. She knew the exact weight of the fleece, the current market price in 3 different counties, and the projected value based on the last 2 winters. She was firm but fair, her arguments sharp and logical. She commanded the conversation and the respect of the merchant, with an ease that Alistair had only ever seen in the most ruthless captains of industry in London. Thorne brought in a tea tray. There were 2 cups. He poured one and handed it to Alara. He poured the second and placed it on a small table beside Alistair's chair, the way one might placate a restless child. The deal was struck. Hands were shaken. Mr. Blevins left, promising to send his carts the next morning, looking thoroughly pleased with the transaction. The study was quiet again. Alara sat back down at the desk, made a few final notes in her ledger, and then looked at him. The polite, professional mask dropped, and the weariness returned to her eyes, but it was a different kind of weariness now. It was the exhaustion of a long day's work, not the exhaustion of despair. Now, she said, her voice losing its businesslike edge and taking on a sharper, more personal tone. Let us speak plainly. Why are you here? The directness of the question was like a splash of cold water. This is my home, he said, the words sounding weak and petulant even to his own ears. No, she corrected him gently. This was your property. It has not been your home for a very long time. You came here, I suspect, for the same reason you sent me here. You came here looking for a quiet place to fall apart. The difference is, I decided not to. She leaned forward, her gray eyes pinning him in place. So, you have a choice, Your Grace. You can stay. You will be given a room. You will be fed. You will be warm. But you'll be a guest. This is my house now. My authority is absolute. My staff is loyal to me. The very ground under your feet yields its profit for me. You will not interfere. You will not give orders. You will not disrupt the running of this estate. She paused, letting the terms sink in. Or, you can take your horse, ride back to London, and continue to be the Duke of Blackwood. You can forget this place and me ever existed, just as you have so successfully done for the past 3 years. The choice is yours." He stared at her, dumbfounded. She was laying out the terms of his surrender. She was offering him lodging in his own house, as if he were a weary traveler seeking shelter from a storm. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was magnificent. It was insane, and it was, he realized with a sinking feeling, entirely, unassailably logical. He had no power here. He was a king in exile, his throne occupied by a far more competent ruler. He was too tired to fight, too broken to be angry. All he could feel was a vast, hollow sense of dislocation. He looked around the warm, tidy room. He looked at the woman who was a stranger to him. He had come here to find an ending. He had found something else entirely, something he could not begin to name. "I will stay," he heard himself say. The words were quiet, defeated. Alara nodded, as if this were the outcome she had expected all along. "Very well," she said. "Thorn will show you to the green room. It has a decent roof, and the chimney draws. Dinner is at 7. We do not dress." She turned back to her papers, her attention already moving on to the next item on her list, the next problem to be solved. The audience was over. Alistair was left to sit in his chair, the cooling cup of tea untouched beside him, a guest in his own life. The storm he had been running from was not in London. It was right here, in this room, and it had a name. It was Alara, and he was utterly, terrifyingly at her mercy. The days that followed were a form of exquisite torture for Alistair. He was a ghost in a house that hummed with life. He had agreed to her terms out of sheer, exhausted paralysis, and now he found himself living in the bizarre reality of them. He was a duke reduced to a specter, haunting the edges of a world that ran with breathtaking efficiency without him. The green room was, as promised, clean and warm. But it was not his room. His chambers, the Duke's chambers, were in one of the closed-off wings. He had asked Thorn about them on the first morning. The groundsman had simply looked at him with that unervingly calm gaze and said, "Her Grace had the entire east wing sealed to conserve heat. Your things are in storage." She said the damp would ruin them. The explanation was practical, logical, and a brutal affirmation of his new status. He was a piece of furniture put into storage. He wandered the functioning parts of the house like a displaced spirit. He saw the bustling kitchens where the cooks sang as they worked. He saw the former laundry, now a schoolroom, where a dozen children sat learning their letters from a young woman hired from the village. He saw the repaired barns, the healthy livestock, the tidy, productive gardens. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of intelligent, relentless industry. He saw Alara's hand in everything. She, in turn, treated him with a polite, infuriating detachment. She was his jailer, but a jailer who provided excellent meals and a warm bed. They ate their meals together in the small, informal dining room she had established off the library. The conversation, when there was any, was relentlessly practical. She would ask his opinion on a point of law regarding a tenant's lease, or the best way to transport wool to the nearest port. With the same impersonal curiosity, she might show a reference book. She was using him, mining his knowledge of the world beyond Blackwood's borders, but she was not connecting with him. She was consulting the Duke, not the man. He tried to assert himself, once. He saw two men struggling to mend a stone wall and, falling back on the familiar muscle memory of command, began to direct them. They listened with polite confusion until Thorn appeared. "Leave them be, Your Grace," Thorn had said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "The Duchess laid out the plan for this wall last week. They know what they're about." It was a public, quiet humiliation. The men went back to their work, following Alara's plan. Alistair was left standing there, useless, his authority less than the dirt under Thorn's boots. After that, he stopped trying. He took to long, solitary walks across the estate, trying to understand the scale of the transformation. The land itself seemed healthier, the air cleaner. He was a stranger in his own domain. His own internal landscape began to mirror the external one. The bitter, angry despair he had brought with him from London had no place here. Despair was a luxury, a form of self-indulgence. Blackwood Manor, under Alara's rule, was a place of relentless, forward-moving pragmatism. It was impossible to wallow in his own ruin when surrounded by so much constructive energy. His ennui felt foolish, his political defeats petty, when measured against the real, tangible victory of a well-thatched roof or a healthy calf. He began to watch her, truly watch her, not as the woman who had thwarted his expectations, but as a phenomenon to be studied. She was a whirlwind of focused energy. He saw her talking to the shepherd with her head bent against the wind, her hand on the man's arm as he described a sickU. He saw her kneeling in the dirt of the garden, her sleeves rolled up, discussing blight with the gardener. He saw her late at night, the single point of light in the study window, her head bent over the accounts. She was not just managing the estate. She was breathing life into it. And he, who had been born to this, who had held the title and the power all his life, had only ever known how to manage its decline. One night, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a constant, low moan around the corners of the house, rose to a furious shriek. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets. It was a storm of biblical proportions, the kind that reminded a man of his own insignificance. Alistair sat in the library, a book unread in his lap, listening to the house groan and shudder around him. It was a solid, reassuring sound, the sound of a well-maintained ship riding out a gale. He thought of his other houses, his grand, perfect houses. He would be in a gilded drawing room, the storm a distant, romantic backdrop to a glass of brandy. Here, the storm was a visceral, living thing, and the house was its opponent. The door opened, and Alara came in, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked toward the window, her brow furrowed with concern. "The river will be rising," she said, more to herself than to him. "I hope the new levee holds." It was the first time he had heard a note of genuine worry in her voice. He found himself wanting to reassure her, to tell her that of course it would hold, that she had planned for everything. As the storm reached its crescendo, a deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the house. It was not a distant rumble. It was a violent, immediate explosion of sound, as if the sky had been torn in two directly overhead. And in that instant, Alistair was no longer in the library at Blackwood Manor. He was on a muddy field in Spain. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of cannon fire. The man next to him, his young, bright-eyed aide, was screaming, his face a mask of confusion as he looked down at the place where his legs used to be. The sound was deafening, the chaos absolute. He was 24 years old, and he was in hell. He didn't realize he was on the floor until he felt the splintering of a small table under his hand. He had knocked it over in his scramble to find cover. His breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Cold sweat drenched his body. The library was gone, replaced by a landscape of smoke and mud and the screams of dying men. The wind, shrieking outside, was the sound of cavalry charge. The rattling of the window was the sound of musket fire. He was trapped. He was going to die. "Your Grace." A voice cut through the noise. It was calm. It was clear. It was not part of the chaos. Alistair. He flinched. No one had called him by his given name in years. He risked a glance up. Through the swirling smoke of his memory, a face emerged. Alara. She was kneeling on the floor in front of him, her expression not one of fear or alarm, but of intense, focused concentration. She was not touching him. She was simply there, a fixed point in the maelstrom. "It's just the storm," she said, her voice even and low. "You are in the library at Blackwood Manor. It is the 3rd of November. You are safe." He shook his head, trying to clear it. But the sound of the rain was still cannon fire. The smell of the wet wool of her shawl was the smell of damp uniforms on a battlefield. "The west flank is collapsing," he gasped, the words torn from a past that was more real than the present. "We have to pull back." "There is no flank," she said, her voice firm, pulling him back. "There is no battle. There is only the rain, and a leaking gutter on the north face of the house that I will need Thorn to look at in the morning." Her words were so bizarre, so relentlessly practical, that they sliced through the panic like a knife. A leaking gutter. The sheer, mundane reality of it was an anchor. "The price of wool," she said, her eyes holding his. What did Blevins say the market in York was doing? "What?" he asked, confused. The smoke was beginning to clear. The screams were fading. "The wool price in York," she repeated patiently. "He said it was holding steady, but I think he was lying. I think the northern mills are paying a premium. What is your opinion on the matter?" She was asking for his advice. On wool, while he was crouched on the floor, a trembling, broken wreck. It was the most absurd, the most ridiculous, the most wonderfully sane thing he had ever heard. He stared at her calm, serious face. She was not coddling him. She was not treating him like a madman. She was treating him like a partner, a consultant whose opinion was valuable, even at this insane moment. He dragged in a deep, shuddering breath. The library began to reassert itself around him. The scent of beeswax and old paper, the warmth of the distant fire, the solid feel of the floorboards beneath his hands. He was lying, Alistair said, his voice a raw whisper. The northern mills, they always pay more after a wet shearing season. The fleece is heavier. A small, satisfied smile touched her lips. "I thought so." She held out a hand, not in pity, but as a simple, practical offer of assistance. After a moment's hesitation, he took it. Her hand was cool and firm, her grip surprisingly strong. She helped him to his feet. He was unsteady, his legs shaking, and he leaned on her for a moment, his hand on her shoulder. He was a head taller than her, a broad, imposing man, and yet, in that moment, she was the one supporting him. She did not flinch under his weight. She was as solid and unyielding as the house around them. The storm outside still raged, but the storm inside him had passed. He stood there, leaning on his wife, the stranger who knew him better than anyone, and for the first time in a decade, he felt the ground beneath his feet. He was not on a battlefield. He was in a library, and he was not alone. The aftermath of the storm was a profound and unnerving quiet. The wind died down, leaving a world washed clean and dripping. Alistair lay awake in his bed in the green room, listening to the silence. It was not the empty, dead silence he had craved, but a living quiet, punctuated by the gentle drip of water from the eaves and the distant, reassuring sigh of a house settling after a battle. He had not slept. His mind kept replaying the scene in the library, the blind, consuming panic, the smoke and the screams of his memory, and Alara, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. Her absurd, wonderful question about the price of wool. She had not recoiled from his madness. She had not pitted him. She had grounded him. She had taken his broken, spinning mind and anchored it to the solid, practical reality of her world. A leaking gutter. The price of wool. No one had ever done that for him before. In the years after the war, his moments of darkness had been met with frightened whispers, with doctors who prescribed laudanum and rest, with a society that pretended his scars did not exist. He had learned to hide them, to bury the trauma under a thick layer of ducal ice. And last night, Alara had shattered that ice with a single, practical question. He felt exposed, and strangely, terrifyingly grateful. He rose before dawn, unable to lie still any longer. He dressed quietly and made his way down through the sleeping house. A single lamp burned in the main hall. He found himself drawn, as if by an invisible thread, toward the kitchens. He had no idea why. It was a part of the house as foreign to him as the moon. The kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting smell of baking bread. One of the ovens was still radiating a gentle heat, and standing at the great central table, in the soft glow of a single lamp, was Alara. She was wearing a simple woolen wrapper over her nightdress, her hair in a long braid down her back. She was not making bread. She was methodically grinding coffee beans in a small, cast-iron mill. The rhythmic, grating sound was the only noise in the vast, quiet room. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. There was no awkwardness in her gaze, no reference to the events of the previous night. "You are awake early, Your Grace," she said simply. "So are you," he replied, his voice rough. He felt like an intruder, a clumsy giant in her well-ordered world. "The baker starts at 4, she explained. "I find the smell helps me to think." She continued to grind the beans, her movements economical and precise. He stood there, feeling useless. He should leave, go back to his room, preserve the polite distance between them. But he couldn't. The, the coffee, he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. Is that for you? It's for the house, she said, not looking up. It helps keep everyone awake. We have a lot to do today. The storm will have brought down trees. The river needs to be checked. He watched her hands. They were not the soft, pale hands of a duchess. They were capable, strong, the knuckles slightly red, the nails short and clean. They were the hands of a woman who worked. I froze, he said suddenly. The confession was torn from him, a raw, ragged thing. In the library. I froze. Alara stopped grinding. She looked at him, her head tilted slightly. She did not offer false comfort. She did not say, "It's all right," she simply waited. "It happens sometimes," he continued, the words a low murmur. "The noise, it brings it back. I haven't lost control like that in years." He was confessing a profound weakness, a failure of the iron control that had defined his entire adult life. He was handing her a weapon, a piece of knowledge she could use against him. He expected her to flinch, to pity him, to use it. Alara finished grinding the beans and tipped the fragrant powder into a small pot. She poured hot water from a kettle on the hearth over them. She did all of this with a deliberate, unhurried grace. "The accounts are a mess," she said, her back to him. Alistair blinked. "What?" She turned back to face him, leaning against the table. "The account for the south-facing farms. The ones bordering the river. The yields have been declining for 5 years, but the tenants' rents have remained the same. It's not sustainable. I've been staring at the numbers for weeks, and I cannot make them balance. I don't know what to do. I feel as though I am failing them." It was her turn to confess. It was not a confession of trauma, but of practical limitation, a problem she could not solve. She was meeting his vulnerability not with pity, but with a vulnerability of her own. It was a trade, a sharing of burdens. He walked over to the table and picked up a stray coffee bean, the rough texture a grounding sensation in his palm. "Let me see them," he said. "You?" she asked, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "My father made me study agricultural law for a year. He called it knowing the soil of your power. I thought it was a tedious waste of time. Perhaps it wasn't." He looked at her. "I know about rents and land law. You know about everything else. Perhaps, together, we can make the numbers balance." For the first time since he had arrived, the silence between them was not a weapon or a void. It was a space of possibility. Alara looked at him, at the haunted, exhausted man who had just offered, in the quiet of a pre-dawn kitchen, to help her. She saw the Duke, the soldier, the broken man. And for the first time, she saw a glimmer of the partner she had never known she needed. She pushed a stray piece of paper and a pencil across the table. "The problem," she said, her voice all business once more, "is the crop rotation." They worked side by side at the kitchen table as the sun rose. The Duke of Blackwood and his forgotten Duchess, their heads bent together over the messy, complicated business of survival. It was not romantic. It was not dramatic. It was simply two people in a warm kitchen beginning to build a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. It started, as everything in Alara's world did, with a practical problem that needed a solution. The kitchen table became their new battlefield, but this time they were on the same side. The partnership that began in the pre-dawn quiet over a cup of coffee and a column of figures slowly, cautiously, began to extend into the rest of their lives. It was a strange and unspoken treaty, an alliance born of shared crisis and mutual, grudging respect. Alistair, for the first time, had a purpose. Alara, armed with his knowledge of law and contracts, began to renegotiate the old, unfair tenancy agreements. Alistair, in turn, found himself learning from her. She taught him not just the names of his tenants, but the names of their children, the specific anxieties of their lives. He had always seen the estate as a set of numbers on a page, a source of income or a drain on his resources. She saw it as a community, a living organism of interconnected lives and responsibilities. He started joining her on her rounds. One morning, he found her not in the study, but in the stables, her sleeves rolled up, helping Thorn muck out a stall. The horse in question was one of the new plow horses, and it had a nasty cough. "The vet from the village is an idiot," she said by way of greeting, not stopping her work. "He wanted to bleed it. Thorn thinks it's a lungworm." Alistair, the duke who had commanded armies, stood awkwardly in the doorway of the stable, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. He had not set foot in a working stable in 20 years. Thorn looked up from mixing a mash of herbs. "Her grace is right. It needs a drench, but the beast won't take it easy." Before he could think about it, Alistair was walking into the stall. "I'll hold its head," he said. Both Alara and Thorn stared at him. "You'll ruin your coat, your grace," Thorn said, stating the obvious. Alistair looked down at his fine, London-made woolen coat. It was a relic of another life, a life of drawing rooms and pristine appearances. Without a second thought, he took it off and hung it on a nail. In his shirt sleeves, he approached the horse. He spoke to it in a low, calm voice, the way he had learned to speak to terrified young recruits on the eve of battle. He stroked its neck, his large hands gentle, until the animal's trembling subsided. He held the horse's head steady while Thorn administered the drench. The horse tossed its head, spattering Alistair's shirt with foul-smelling herbal medicine. He did not flinch. When it was over, he stepped back, wiping his hands on his breeches. Alara was watching him, a strange expression on her face. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a piece of straw in her hair. He had the absurd, sudden urge to reach out and remove it. He did not. Instead, he said, "We should review the forestry accounts. I think we can get a better price for the oak if we sell it directly to the naval shipyards." She nodded, her eyes still holding that unreadable expression. After lunch, she agreed. It became their new normal. They worked. They moved through the days in a shared rhythm of practical tasks. They talked about drainage and livestock, about repairing the mill and educating the tenants' children. The silence between them changed its nature. It was no longer a wall, but a shared space, a comfortable quiet that did not need to be filled with meaningless words. One afternoon, they were in the library, working their way through a mountain of paperwork. Alistair was explaining a complex clause in a land use agreement. He leaned over her shoulder to point to a line on the map, his arm brushing against hers. A jolt, like a static charge, passed between them. It was not a romantic touch. It was accidental, fleeting, and utterly grounding. He was suddenly aware of her scent, not of perfume, but of soap and fresh air and the faint, clean smell of ink. He was aware of the warmth of her skin through the thin wool of her sleeve. He saw the delicate hairs on the nape of her neck where her braid had come loose. He pulled back as if he had been burned. Alara did not move, her gaze fixed on the map, but a faint flush had risen on her cheeks. Neither of them acknowledged it. They went back to discussing the map, their voices a little too formal, a little too precise. But something had shifted. A new awareness had entered the room, a low hum of energy that had nothing to do with crop rotation or legal clauses. He had come to Blackwood, seeking an escape from the duties that had broken him. But he was finding that duty, in this new, tangible form, was a kind of salvation. Mending a fence, balancing a ledger, holding a sick horse's head. These were small, real things. They had a beginning, a middle, and an end. You could see the results of your labor. Unlike the shifting, treacherous sands of politics, this work was honest. It was grounding. He was not the Duke of Blackwood here. He was simply Alistair, a man who was good with horses and had a knack for legal language. And he was beginning to realize, with a sense of profound and terrifying clarity, that he had never been happier in his entire life. He was falling in love, not with the ghost of the girl he had married, but with the formidable, practical, ink-stained woman who had built a kingdom in his absence. He was falling in love with his wife, and he had no idea what to do about it. The first snow of winter fell on a quiet Tuesday in December. It came softly at first, then with a thick, determined silence, blanketing the estate in a layer of pristine white. The world outside the windows of the study became a simple, clean composition of black branches against a white landscape. The house was sealed in a warm, living hard in the cold grip of winter. A truce had been declared, not just between Alara and Alistair, but with the world itself. The harvest was in, the livestock were sheltered, the larder was full. For the first time in years, Blackwood Manor was ready for winter. It was a fortress, secure and self-sufficient. Inside, a new kind of quiet had settled. The frantic energy of the harvest and the repairs had given way to a slower, more domestic rhythm. Alistair found himself learning the geography of this new life. He learned that Alara took her tea with no sugar. He learned that she had a slight, almost imperceptible dimple that appeared by her mouth when she was genuinely amused, a rare and precious occurrence. He learned that she could not abide the smell of lavender, but loved the scent of rosemary. He, in turn, revealed his own small, unconscious habits. The way he paced when he was thinking through a problem. The way he would unconsciously straighten a stack of books. The way his right hand would sometimes clench a phantom grip on a sword that was no longer there. Alara noticed it all, filing the information away with the same quiet efficiency with which she managed everything else. They were circling each other, two planets that had found a strange, stable orbit. The raw, desperate need that had driven him to her during the storm had been sublimated into the steady hum of their working partnership. But the memory of it, the feeling of her hand in his, the solid presence of her in the face of his chaos, remained. It was an unspoken truth between them. He wanted to break the silence. He wanted to tell her what? That he was sorry? That he admired her? That he was falling in love with her? The words felt clumsy, inadequate, and dangerous. He had built his life on a foundation of control and dispassion. To speak of such things felt like a betrayal of every instinct he had. And what if she rejected him? She had built this world without him. She did not need him. To need someone was to give them power over you. He knew that better than anyone. So he said nothing. He showed her, instead. He took over the mending of the library fire, ensuring it never went out. He learned to make the coffee she liked, strong and black. He spent a week in the drafty estate office, organizing 3 decades of unsorted deeds and records, a Herculean task of selfless, boring labor that made her eyes widen in silent appreciation. They were small offerings, a siege conducted not with cannons, but with quiet acts of service. And then the old world came calling. It arrived in the form of a royal courier, a man so out of place in the quiet, snowbound world of Blackwood that he seemed like a creature from another dimension. He arrived on a lathered horse, his uniform a slash of improbable scarlet against the white snow, his face blue with cold. He carried a dispatch sealed with the king's own crest. Thorne brought him into the study, where Alistair and Alara were going over the plans for the spring planting. The courier's eyes, accustomed to the grandeur of the court, swept over the comfortable, slightly shabby room, over the Duke in his shirt sleeves and the Duchess with a smudge of ink on her nose, with ill-disguised disdain. "Your Grace," he said, his voice stiff with formality and cold, handing the dispatch to Alistair. "An urgent message from His Majesty. I am instructed to wait for your reply." Alistair took the heavy parchment. The familiar weight of it, the scent of the expensive wax, was a visceral reminder of a life he had left behind. He broke the seal. The king's flourishing, impatient script covered the page. It was a summons. A political crisis was brewing, a coalition government was on the verge of collapse, and the king needed his most ruthless, most effective, most detached problem solver. He needed the Duke of Blackwood. He was being called back to the game. As he read, he was acutely aware of Alara. He saw her from the corner of his eye. The moment the courier had entered the room, she had changed. The easy partnership of the last few months had vanished. She had retreated behind a mask of cool, polite formality. Her back was straighter, her expression unreadable. She was no longer Alara, his partner. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, a silent, decorative presence in her husband's study. She had already accepted his departure. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders. She was putting her walls back up, brick by silent brick. This interlude, this strange, quiet winter of their partnership, was over. He was the Duke, and the Duke's duty was to the crown, to London, to the endless, grinding machine of power. Blackwood Manor was just a temporary refuge, and she, its caretaker. He finished reading the letter. The world it described, the intrigue, the power plays, the hollow men vying for position, felt distant and unreal. It was a world of ghosts and shadows compared to the solid, tangible reality of this room, of the woman standing by the fireplace. The courier cleared his throat, impatient. "Your Grace." Alistair looked from the letter in his hand to Alara. She was staring into the fire, her profile a perfect, remote cameo. She was not going to fight for him. She was not going to ask him to stay. She had survived his abandonment once. She was prepared to do it again. Her pride, her fierce, stubborn independence, would not allow her to show any weakness. And in that moment, he understood. He understood that her strength was both her greatest weapon and her most vulnerable shield. He understood that to leave now would be to break something far more valuable than a political coalition. It would be to break the fragile, unspoken trust they had so painstakingly built. He looked at the king's summons, at the life of cold, lonely power it represented. And then he looked at Alara, at the warmth of the fire, at the promise of shared life built on solid, practical ground. He had a choice, not between two duties, but between two worlds. The world he had been born to, and the world he had, by accident, helped to create. He walked slowly to the fireplace. The courier watched him, expecting him to go to the desk to pen his reply. Alara did not move, her gaze still fixed on the flames. Alistair stood beside her, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He held the king's letter out over the fire. "Your Grace," the courier said, his voice sharp with alarm. Without a word, Alistair let the dispatch drop from his fingers. It caught the edge of a log, curled, blackened, and then burst into a sudden, bright flare of orange flame. It burned quickly, the king's words turning to black, floating ash that danced up the chimney. The silence in the room was absolute. The courier stared, his mouth agape in horror and disbelief. Thorn, who had been standing by the door, allowed a slow, satisfied smile to spread across his face. Alara finally turned her head. She looked from the ashes in the grate to Alistair's face. Her own was a mask of stunned confusion. Her gray eyes were wide, the walls of her fortress momentarily breached. Alistair turned to the courier. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it held a finality that was more powerful than any shout. "Tell His Majesty," he said, "that the Duke of Blackwood is dead. He died 3 years ago. I am merely the man who is looking after his widow. My duty is here now." He then looked at Alara, and for the first time, he allowed the truth of his heart to show in his eyes. He stripped away the ice, the control, the years of practiced detachment. He let her see the soldier, the broken man, the penitent husband, and the man who loved her. "This is my home," he said, his voice dropping so that only she could hear. "You are my home." The courier, speechless, finally seemed to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. He backed out of the room, followed by a quietly triumphant Thorn, who closed the study door with a soft, decisive click, leaving them alone. The air crackled with the unspoken. The grand gesture had been made. The declaration was hanging in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Alara stared at him, her lips slightly parted. The cool, capable mistress of Blackwood Manor was gone, and in her place was a woman who looked utterly lost. He had shattered her world, not with cruelty, but with an act of shocking, incomprehensible devotion. She had prepared for every eventuality except this one. She had no ledger, no map for what was happening in her own heart. A single, traitorous tear escaped her control and traced a silver path down her cheek. She angrily swiped it away, as if infuriated by its very existence. "That was," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "a deeply impractical thing to do. The king will be furious." "Let him be furious," Alistair said softly. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently cupped her face. His thumb brushed away the lingering dampness of her tear. "I've spent my entire life doing the practical thing, the dutiful thing, and it brought me nothing but dust and ashes. You build a kingdom out of dust and ashes. I would rather be a commoner in your kingdom than a king anywhere else." She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her eyes searched his, looking for the lie, the calculation, the hidden motive. She found none. She found only a deep, quiet sincerity that mirrored the vast, uncharted territory opening up within her own chest. He had not just rejected a summons. He had rejected his title, his past, his entire identity for her. He had chosen this small, isolated world they had built over the great, glittering world he commanded. He had seen her, truly seen her, and he had chosen to stay. The last of her defenses, the final wall of her self-sufficient fortress, crumbled into dust. The overwhelming relief, the terrifying, exhilarating joy of it, was too much to bear. A sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion she had not allowed herself in years, broke from her lips. And she fell apart. She collapsed against him, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces, and for the first time, he was there to catch her. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head, his own eyes closed against the sudden, sharp sting of tears. He held her as she wept, for the lonely years, for the fear, for the relief, for the sheer, overwhelming shock of being loved. He held her, not as a duke holding his duchess, but as a man holding his entire world. He was an anchor, and she was the storm. They stood there for a long time, locked together in the warm, quiet study, the fire crackling in the hearth, the snow falling softly outside the window. The house, their house, which they had fought for and healed and brought back to life, held them in its solid, peaceful embrace. It was no longer a tomb or a fortress. It was a home, fiercely alive and, at long last, completely whole.